I found out my daughter got married the same way strangers did, through a photo online. No invitation, no call. I stared at her smile on my phone, realizing I had been erased from one of the most important days of her life. Years of sacrifice, of choosing stability over comfort, of telling myself that love meant staying quiet. All of it meant nothing in that moment. But that was only the beginning. Because months later, when my name surfaced on financial documents I had never signed, I understood the truth. The wedding was not the deepest betrayal. What followed was far worse. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how these stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments make this community special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, get comfortable, take a breath, and let's begin. My name is Evelyn Moore, and I am 58 years old. I live in Monterey, California, in a quiet place where the mornings smell like salt and pine, and the sound of the ocean never fully disappears. People who visit often say it must be lonely here, but they misunderstand. Loneliness is not the absence of noise. Loneliness is being unseen in the middle of a life you helped build. I did not plan to live this way. Years ago, I was a nurse specializing in end-of-life care, working long night shifts in sterile hospital rooms where time felt suspended. I knew how to sit beside grief without turning away, but nothing prepared me for losing my own husband to pancreatic cancer. In his final months, pain changed him, and care became a language we spoke without words. When he died, the silence afterward felt louder than any hospital ward I had ever worked in. With the insurance money and what little savings we had, I bought an old seaside lodge near Big Sur. It was weathered, with faded wood siding and outdated plumbing, but it overlooked the cliffs where my husband and I once watched the sun lower itself into the Pacific. I did not buy it to start a business. I bought it because I needed a place where my grief could exist without explanation. The first years were a blur of work. I cleaned rooms, replaced broken fixtures, washed linens late into the night, and greeted every guest myself. I learned the rhythm of the tides, the way fog rolled in like a curtain, and how the building creaked differently depending on the weather. Slowly, without making a formal decision, the lodge became something else. It became a retreat for people over 50 who were tired of noise, tired of pretending they were not allowed to rest yet. I never advertised luxury. What I offered was quiet, order, and safety. Guests drank tea on the deck, read books they had carried around for years, and slept without alarms. Caring for them felt familiar, like nursing without machines, without emergencies. I did not realize it then, but I was also learning how to care for myself. My daughter, Lauren, lived far from this life. She built her career in San Diego, working in luxury real estate marketing, surrounded by glass towers and polished language. When she was younger, she complained that my work hours embarrassed her, that my car was too loud, that I did not dress like the other mothers. When she grew older, she stopped complaining and learned something far worse: silence. Our conversations became shorter. Calls turned into texts. Texts turned into polite check-ins, spaced weeks apart. I told myself she was busy, that this was normal, that independence always looked like distance before it softened again. I wanted to believe that loving her meant stepping back. At the lodge, I often listened as guests my age spoke of Sunday dinners, of adult children who called daily, of grandchildren whose pictures filled their phones. I smiled and asked questions, then returned to my office overlooking the sea. I did not envy them. I only wondered what I had done differently. Still, I held on to one quiet certainty. No matter how far Lauren drifted, there were lines she would not cross. weddings, births, moments that defined a life. I believed that even if she had learned to place me at the edges of her world, she would not erase me entirely. That belief sustained me more than I realized, and like many beliefs held too tightly, it was already preparing me for the moment it would finally break. If you're still watching and beginning to feel the quiet distance growing in this story, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what happened next was the moment I realized I was already being pushed out of my own daughter's life. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The afternoon it happened looked like every other afternoon at the retreat. The ocean was calm, the sky muted with thin coastal clouds, and the lobby smelled faintly of bergamot tea. I was moving slowly, deliberately, refilling cups for a retired couple from Oregon who had come for a week of quiet after selling their home. Nothing in the air warned me that the story I believed about my place in my daughter's life was about to collapse. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my cardigan while I stood near the front desk. I ignored it at first. Guests came here precisely because I did not rush at every buzz. When the vibration came again, I glanced down and saw the name Marianne, a woman I used to work alongside during my nursing years. We had stayed loosely in touch, checking in a few times a year. Her message carried a screenshot. For a second, I could not tell what I was seeing. Then the image sharpened. A vineyard stretched across the background, long rows of green vines glowing under warm lights. In the center stood my daughter, Lauren, dressed in white lace, her arm linked with a man I did not recognize. She was smiling the way people do when they believe every eye in the room belongs to them. Beneath the photo was a caption that read, "Rehearsal dinner tonight." My hand tightened around the phone. The teacup I was holding tilted just enough for hot liquid to lap against the rim. I set it down before it spilled and apologized to the guests, though I could barely hear my own voice. My chest felt hollow, like all the air had been pulled out too quickly for my lungs to adjust. I stepped into the hallway behind the front desk and opened Instagram on my own phone. I typed Lauren's name the way I had typed it hundreds of times before. Nothing appeared. I checked the spelling. Still nothing. A vague unease settled in as I tried again, then switched to another account, then another. Each attempt ended the same way, with a blank search result and a quiet confirmation forming in my mind. I moved through every platform I could think of, resisting the conclusion I already felt pressing against my ribs. Facebook, messages, even email. The pattern was unmistakable. I had not been forgotten. I had been removed. I called her number, hoping for the smallest chance that this was all a misunderstanding, that she would answer and explain why I had not been told yet. The call rang until it slipped into voicemail. I left a message, careful with every word, asking only if she was okay and whether what I had seen was real. I told her I hoped she was happy. I did not ask why I was not there. The day passed in a blur I cannot fully remember. By evening, the retreat had quieted, shutters closed against the cool air drifting in from the water. I sat alone on the wooden bench that faced the sea, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands. Somewhere inland, my daughter was rehearsing a future that did not include me. I imagined details I had never been given: the music, the laughter. The moment she would walk down an aisle, I was not meant to see. I wondered who had helped her with the dress, who had fastened the clasp at the back, who had stood in the place a mother usually stands. As the sky darkened, my thoughts turned inward, the way they always had before. I asked myself if I had been too distracted by work, too tired, too plain. I replayed years of missed school events and late dinners, searching for the moment that might have taught her I was optional. What I did not know then was that while I sat listening to the ocean breathe, My name was already being written on documents I had never seen, in cities I had never visited. The wedding was not the end of something between us. It was the beginning of a truth that had been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to surface. If you're still here, and that discovery stung more than you expected, comment number 2 to let me know you felt it too. What I saw next didn't just break my heart, it planted a question I could not ignore. Let's move on to chapter 3. Nearly 4 years passed after the wedding I never attended. Life, in its stubborn way, kept moving. The retreat in Monterey grew busier, then expanded quietly into Carmel by the Sea and later Santa Barbara. I learned how to delegate without losing control, how to trust a small team that cared about stillness and order the way I did. The days found a rhythm that felt earned rather than accidental. When the article appeared, I read it alone in my office before the staff arrived. A national financial magazine had written about my retreat portfolio, describing it as a model for intentional aging. The number stood out more than the words, $100 million. I sat with that figure longer than I expected, thinking not of wealth, but of how many years it took to build something that could survive without my constant vigilance. I closed the article and went back to work. 2 days later, the phone rang while I was reviewing maintenance schedules. The number on the screen carried an Arizona area code. Normally, I let unfamiliar calls go to voicemail, but something about the timing pressed at me. I answered. The voice on the other end was polite and precise, asking to confirm my identity before referencing a commercial loan tied to a resort property outside Phoenix. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, the kind that happens when databases overlap. I explained calmly that I had never owned property in Arizona and had no such loan. There was a pause. Then the voice returned, steady and rehearsed, explaining that I was listed as a guarantor and that the account was now several months behind. I felt irritation rise, followed by a chill that crept down my spine. I repeated, more firmly, that this had to be an error. Within minutes, an email arrived. I stared at the subject line before opening it, already bracing myself for something I could not yet name. The document inside was formal and dense, filled with terms I recognized too well. Then I saw my name, printed neatly at the top, Evelyn Grace Moore. Beneath it, a signature I knew and did not know at the same time. The resemblance was undeniable, but so was the difference. The curves were too even, the pressure too consistent. My hands had never moved that smoothly across paper, especially not on documents that mattered. I scrolled through the pages, my breath shallow, noticing dates, locations, and a project description that mentioned a resort intended to host events and private bookings. I leaned back in my chair, the room suddenly too quiet. The ocean outside my window continued its steady motion, indifferent to the sharp turn my thoughts had taken. I opened an older contract from my files and compared the signatures side by side. The truth settled slowly but firmly. Someone had practiced writing my name. I did not try to reason it away. Years in healthcare had taught me the danger of ignoring early symptoms. I forwarded the documents to Daniel Harris, the attorney who had overseen my business structure from the beginning. The message I sent him was brief, stripped of emotion. I asked him to review everything and call me as soon as he could. When he did, his tone was careful but unmistakably serious. He said that if this document was legitimate, then it was unlikely to be the only one. He suggested we take time, gather information, and avoid making assumptions until we understood the scope. After the call ended, I sat alone and thought about Napa Valley, about vineyards and warm lights. I thought about the wedding I had seen only through a screen and the pathways that had led me there, the timing, the locations, the silence that followed. Pieces began to align in ways I resisted naming. I was not ready to speak my daughter's name aloud yet. Still, as the light faded outside my office, I felt the certainty growing. Whatever had been done in my name had not happened by accident, and the story I thought I understood was only beginning to show its shape. If you're still watching and starting to sense that this story is shifting from emotional pain to something much darker, comment number 3 below. Because once I saw my name where it did not belong, everything began to unravel. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After the call with the bank, the world did not fall apart. That was what unsettled me most. The retreat continued to run on schedules and checklists. Guests arrived with rolling suitcases and tired eyes. The ocean kept its rhythm. Only I felt the shift, like a floorboard loosened beneath a familiar room. I waited for Daniel to return with more information, checking my email more often than I liked to admit. Each notification sent a small jolt through me, followed by disappointment when it turned out to be nothing urgent. In the quiet spaces between tasks, memories surfaced without permission. Napa Valley, white lace. The certainty that had once lived in me and cracked without warning. Late that afternoon, my phone vibrated again. This time, I looked immediately. The number was not saved, but I knew it before I read the message. Mom, can we talk tonight? I really need you. Please come to San Diego. I read it once, then again, studying the words as if they held a code I could break. There was no greeting, no reference to the years of distance, no apology for the wedding I was never invited to see. The center of the message was not connection, but need. For a moment, habit pulled at me. The instinct to respond quickly, to reassure, to show up without conditions rose as naturally as breathing. I closed my eyes and pictured Lauren as a child, sitting cross-legged on the floor with homework spread around her, asking for help before she admitted she was stuck. That image had power. It always had. But the documents from Arizona were still open on my desk. I did not reply right away. Instead, I forwarded the message to Daniel with a single line asking for his thoughts. His response came sooner than I expected. He advised me to go if I felt I needed answers, but to listen more than speak and promise nothing. He reminded me that timing matters, especially when money is involved. I told the staff I would be away for the evening and gathered what I needed for the drive south. The late sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as I locked the office door. I felt composed, almost detached, as if my body had already accepted what my heart was still negotiating. The drive along the coast was quiet. The cliffs gave way to open stretches of highway, the ocean flashing in and out of view like a witness that refused to intervene. I let my thoughts run without steering them. I remembered the hospital room 3 years earlier, the beeping monitors, the nurse asking me to sign forms while my chest ached in a way I blamed on stress. I remembered Lauren's face close to mine, urgent but calm, telling me everything was routine. Halfway through the drive, Daniel sent another message. He had found a document connected to my hospital stay. A financial power of attorney filed at the same time as the medical authorization. It was legitimate in appearance and limited in scope, but broad enough to be abused by someone willing to stretch its intent. I pulled off at a rest stop and sat in the car with the engine running. The message from Lauren remained open on my phone. In a different light, the words looked sharp rather than tender. The timing no longer felt coincidental. It felt calculated. I understood then that whatever waited for me in San Diego would not be a simple conversation. I was not being invited to reconnect. I was being summoned. When I started the car again, the ocean disappeared from view, replaced by city lights ahead. I was still going to see my daughter, but something fundamental had changed. I was not arriving as the mother who would absorb confusion and clean up consequences. I was arriving as the person whose name had been used without consent. As the miles passed, I accepted a truth I had avoided for years. Love without boundaries had brought me here. And boundaries, long overdue, were finally coming with me. If you're still with me and wondering whether that message came from love or desperation, comment number 4 below. What happened when we finally sat face to face changed the course of everything. Let's move on to chapter 5. Lauren and Ethan's apartment sat high above the bay in San Diego, wrapped in glass and pale stone, the kind of place meant to signal arrival. Everything inside looked intentional, curated to suggest calm success. Neutral furniture, abstract art, a view designed to distract you from asking the wrong questions. I stepped in slowly, aware of how little of myself belonged in that space. Lauren hugged me, but her body felt rigid, as if the gesture were a habit rather than an instinct. Her eyes flicked away too often. Ethan shook my hand firmly and smiled in a way that felt practiced, already moving towards conversation before silence could settle. I took a seat on the edge of the sofa and waited. Ethan spoke first, launching into an explanation of market cycles, timing, and opportunity. He described future projects with confidence, using words that sounded impressive until they began to blur together. Lauren added pieces about stress and pressure, touching my arm lightly as if reminding me of our shared history. I listened without interruption, letting the rhythm of their voices reveal more than their words. When there was a pause, I asked about Arizona. I did not raise my voice or soften it. I simply asked whether there was a reason my name appeared as a guarantor on a commercial loan tied to a resort outside Phoenix. The room changed immediately. Lauren's face drained of color. Ethan's posture stiffened, his expression shifting from polished to guarded. Before either of them answered, my phone vibrated. Daniel's email had arrived exactly when it needed to. I opened the attachment and scrolled as Lauren leaned forward, her hands twisting together. The documents were thorough, clinical in their clarity. 7 loans in total, multiple properties, all connected to a financial power of attorney created during my hospital stay 3 years earlier. I did not need to read every line to understand the picture they formed. Dates and locations aligned with too much precision. One entry stopped me entirely. A line item referencing a venue in Napa Valley, labeled as event preparation and launch expenses. I felt something inside me go very still. The wedding had not only excluded me, it had been financed through my name. Lauren broke down then, speaking quickly, explaining how everything had felt temporary, how success had seemed just one step away if they could maintain appearances. She spoke of embarrassment, of wanting to belong to a world where names like mine opened doors rather than closed them. Ethan shifted the blame toward urgency and misunderstanding, framing decisions as necessities rather than choices. I watched them from a place that felt distant, as though I were observing a case rather than living it. The loss arrived quietly. Not anger, not rage, but the deep recognition that a boundary I believed sacred had been crossed without hesitation. I had assumed that no matter how far Lauren drifted, she would never use me as leverage. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a heavy silence layered with truths that could not be taken back. In that stillness, I understood something that had taken me years to admit. Trust had been replaced by entitlement long before this moment. I had simply chosen not to see it. I gathered my phone and slipped it back into my bag. I told them I would need time, not to consider helping, but to decide how to proceed. I stood, feeling older and clearer in equal measure. As I stepped toward the door, I crossed an invisible line. I was no longer just a mother facing disappointment. I was the person whose identity had been used, whose life now required a decision that would change everything that followed. I sat in my car for several minutes after leaving Lauren's apartment, the engine off, my hands resting in my lap. The city lights reflected off the windshield in a blur that felt unreal, as if I were watching someone else's life stall at an intersection. I did not cry. I did not feel the urge to scream. What filled me instead was a heavy, deliberate stillness that settled once emotion had exhausted its usefulness. The facts arranged themselves with uncomfortable clarity. My name had been used. My trust had been stretched beyond recognition. What happened next depended on one decision, and only one. I could report everything immediately, allow the machinery of law to descend without restraint, and watch as my daughter's life collapsed into public record. Or I could step fully into the reality of what I had built and use it to contain the damage before it swallowed more than it already had. For the first time in my life, I forced myself to consider the problem without placing motherhood at the center of it. Hundreds of people depended on the retreat system to function. Employees who trusted the stability I promised, guests who planned their lives around the safety and care my places offered. Charity toward my daughter could become negligence toward everyone else. I called Daniel from the driver's seat, my voice measured despite the hour. I asked him what it would take to gain control of the situation without escalating it into chaos. He did not try to soften his response. The path forward came with risk, financial exposure, legal complexity, reputational strain. The safer route, he said, would be to disengage emotionally and let the system punish what it found. I stared ahead at the street as he spoke, weighing the words. Then I told him I wanted to move faster than that. I asked what it would look like to purchase the debts outright, consolidate them under an entity I controlled, and stop the situation from deteriorating further. There was a pause long enough for me to recognize the shift in conversation. He said it could be done, but that it would change the balance of power permanently. That was the point. I was not trying to rescue Lauren. Rescue had been my instinct for decades, and it had taught her the wrong lessons. I was trying to make sure no one could ever use my identity again without my consent. Control was not cruelty. It was responsibility arriving late, but firmly. Later that night, back at my office in Monterey, I reviewed the first drafts Daniel sent. Legal language carved the air into clean edges, stripping the situation of its personal ache. I signed with a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from finality. Once the process began, there would be no retreat into denial. As dawn crept across the water, I thought of all the times I had stepped in quietly to smooth over consequences Lauren never fully faced. I had mistaken endurance for love, sacrifice for virtue. In doing so, I had taught her that my limits were theoretical. That lesson ended here. I knew what would follow: resistance, accusations, a narrative where I would be framed as cold or calculating. I accepted that as part of the cost. The alternative was allowing erosion to continue unchecked. When the sun rose fully, I felt something unfamiliar but stabilizing settle inside me. The decision was made, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that saving myself did not require destroying anyone else. It required refusing to disappear any longer. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 to let me know you stayed through the turning point. Because choices have consequences, and what followed spread far beyond our family. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. Chapter 7, When the Consequences Finally Arrived. The days that followed my decision did not arrive with drama. There were no police cars, no shouted accusations, no doors slammed in the night. Instead, the consequences entered quietly, through emails, formal letters, and calendar invites that multiplied across my screen. It was the kind of aftermath that looked uneventful from the outside and irreversible from within. Daniel and his team moved with efficiency that bordered on clinical. Banks in Phoenix, Napa Valley, and San Diego were contacted, files requested, balances confirmed. The language shifted from reassurance to compliance as each institution acknowledged the transfer of obligation. Debts were consolidated, terms rewritten, authority reassigned. I watched the process from my office. The same chair, the same ocean beyond the window, now bearing witness to a different kind of tide turning. When the notices went out, they were brief and unmistakable. Lauren and Ethan were informed that their lenders had changed. Payments, negotiations, and future decisions would now route through the holding company I controlled. There was no personal commentary attached, no explanation or apology. The message was structural, not emotional. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Ethan reacted first. His name appeared on my phone, then again, then several times in quick succession. I let the calls go unanswered. When he finally sent a message, it was framed as outrage wrapped in legal threats. He accused me of betrayal, of weaponizing my success, of misunderstanding how business worked. I did not reply. I forwarded the message to Daniel and closed the file. Lauren's call came later that night. Her voice sounded different than it had in San Diego. Thinner, stripped of the practiced confidence I had seen in the apartment. She cried openly, speaking without structure, jumping from apology to fear to disbelief. She said she never imagined it would go this far. I listened without interrupting, my attention steady and contained. When she finished, there was nothing heaving inside me urging a fix. I told her, calmly, that actions had consequences and that those consequences were now underway. I explained that everything would proceed through legal channels, not family ones. It was the first time I had ever spoken to her that way, and the silence that followed confirmed that she understood the shift. What surprised me most was not their reactions, but the ease with which I held my line. The instinct to soften my stance did not arrive the way it used to. I recognized it as a learned reflex, something I had practiced until it felt natural. Letting it go felt like setting down a weight I had forgotten I was carrying. As paperwork advanced, I began thinking beyond recovery. Possession alone did not feel complete. These properties, stripped of their original narratives, waited for definition. I found myself returning to the stories guests had shared at my retreats, of funds drained quietly by relatives they trusted, of signatures rushed through under the guise of help. The pattern was familiar now. Word began to circulate in quiet channels. Consultants asked questions. Local reporters left polite messages. I did not engage yet. This was not a story I intended to shape through noise. Each evening, I walked along the shoreline near the retreat, watching the horizon blur into darkness. I no longer wondered what my daughter would think. The question had changed. I asked myself whether I could live with the outcome I was creating, knowing the cost. Each night, the answer held steady. Consequences, I learned, do not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come with clarity, settling in place until denial has nowhere left to hide. After the initial waves of reaction passed, silence returned in a different shape. It was not the silence of avoidance or denial, but the quiet that follows when the necessary has already been done. My days regained structure. Though the context had changed, I was no longer responding to crisis. I was deciding what came next. Daniel sent over a comprehensive inventory of the assets that now sat under my control. A modern apartment overlooking San Diego Bay. A cultivated property in Napa Valley, originally intended as an event venue. An unfinished development outside Phoenix, bare and exposed, waiting for purpose. I studied each with a distance that surprised me. These were no longer symbols of betrayal. They were empty containers. The most obvious course would have been to liquidate everything, reclaim value, close the chapter cleanly. That advice came quickly, from financial consultants and colleagues who spoke in percentages and exit strategies. It was practical, it was efficient, and it felt wrong. For years, women had come to my retreats carrying invisible damage. Over shared meals and quiet evenings, they told stories that unfolded slowly, reluctantly. Grown children who managed their finances and drained accounts one transfer at a time. Relatives who convinced them to sign documents they barely understood. Each story shared a common thread. The exploitation was never loud. It came wrapped in familiarity and trust. As I sat with the inventory again, the alignment was undeniable. The properties represented more than loss. They were opportunities to interrupt a pattern I had now lived myself. I realized I did not want to erase what had happened by selling everything off. I wanted to redirect it. The idea arrived without ceremony. Instead of properties meant to elevate appearances, these spaces could become environments designed for safety. Residences and retreats for women over 55 who needed time, stability, and legal clarity to rebuild. Not shelters defined by scarcity, but places rooted in dignity and calm. Once the decision took form, it settled quickly. I contacted architects known for their work with healing spaces rather than luxury brands. We spoke about light, acoustics, privacy. I walked them through rooms myself, explaining what quiet should feel like, how security should be invisible rather than restrictive. I did not delegate this part. Purpose required presence. Some advisors questioned the direction. They asked whether this was personal healing disguised as philanthropy. I listened, then moved forward unchanged. I had spent enough years explaining myself. This choice did not need justification to be valid. We planned private suites, shared kitchens designed for conversation, rooms for legal consultations and financial education. Every detail reflected a question I had once asked and never received an answer for. How does someone start over when trust has been breached by those closest to them? As word reached broader circles, reactions varied. Some praised the vision. Some cautioned against entangling public goodwill with a complicated personal story. I understood both positions. What I did not feel was hesitation. Standing inside the first empty space slated for transformation, sunlight pouring across an unfinished floor, I felt something shift fully into place. This was not about reclaiming control for its own sake. It was about choosing meaning over erasure. For the first time since the wedding I never attended, I noticed that my thoughts no longer circled back to my daughter. The absence of that reflex felt telling. I was no longer moving in reaction. I was moving forward. Loss, I learned, does not have to be the final state. When handled with intent, it can become the foundation for something honest, something that holds. If you're still here and starting to see where all of this is leading, comment number 8 below. The ending of this story isn't loud, but it is final. Let's move on to how everything ultimately comes full circle. The opening day did not feel like an event. There were no banners, no speeches, no cameras waiting for the right angle. Women arrived quietly, one by one, carrying overnight bags or small suitcases, their expressions cautious but relieved. This place was not designed to impress. It was built to hold. I stayed near the back of the common room, observing as staff showed guests to their rooms and explained schedules without urgency. Some women asked few questions. Others asked many, their voices shaking slightly as if they still expected the floor to give way. I recognized that posture immediately. It was the stance of someone who had learned that security could disappear without warning. As they settled in, I noticed details I had obsessed over during planning. Wide hallways without shadows, doors that closed softly, chairs positioned for conversation rather than performance. These choices mattered more to me than any public acknowledgement ever could. This was the outcome I had been working toward, even before I understood why. In their faces, I saw versions of myself from different years. Women who had trusted the wrong person, women who had stayed silent too long, women who had confused endurance with obligation. There was no announcement binding us together, but the recognition moved naturally, without explanation. Later that evening, Daniel called with a brief update. Legal processes were still unfolding. Lauren was working with her attorneys, cooperating where necessary, attempting to mitigate the damage. There were options available to her if she complied fully. I listened, thanked him, and ended the call without offering instructions. This was no longer my terrain to manage. A reporter reached out the following morning. I agreed to answer one question. When asked what motivated the project, I said that safety should never be a reward given only to those who never trusted the wrong person. I declined further comment. I had no interest in narrating my pain for consumption. As the day continued, I found myself lingering less on what had been taken and more on what had shifted. The ache I once carried like a second spine had softened, not vanished, but loosened, no longer dictating my movements. I realized that I was not waiting for an apology I might never receive. That expectation had quietly left me. There was no moment of victory, no surge of satisfaction. What replaced those fantasies was something steadier, clean. I could breathe without monitoring the reaction of someone else. I could make decisions without bracing for emotional fallout. In the quiet of the late afternoon, I stood alone in the lobby and watched sunlight stretch across the floor. My phone remained in my bag. No messages demanded attention. No unresolved conversations lingered. What surprised me was not the absence of noise, but how natural it felt. Freedom, I learned, does not always arrive with relief or celebration. Sometimes it enters quietly, when there is finally nothing left to defend and no one left to convince. If I look back now, I understand that the moment my daughter did not invite me to her wedding was never really about a ceremony. It was the first clear signal that I had been removed from a place of respect long before I knew it. I was not excluded because I was absent. I was excluded because my presence no longer served the story she wanted to tell. For many years, I confused love with endurance. I believed that staying quiet made me generous, that flexibility meant maturity, that asking less of others proved my strength. Somewhere along the way, that belief turned against me. Love, when it asks you to disappear, is no longer love. It is surrender dressed in softer language. What I learned far later than I should have is that boundaries are not punishments. They are not threats or ultimatums. Boundaries are simple statements of value. They say, this is how I allow myself to be treated. Even when it's set late, they matter. Perhaps especially then. If you are a woman in your 50s, 60s, or beyond, you may have been taught that it is too late to redraw the lines of your life. That lesson is convenient for people who benefit from your silence. There is no age at which self-respect expires. There is no deadline on choosing yourself. I do not deny the bond between parent and child. It is real and it is strong, but it is not absolute. Blood may explain connection, but it does not excuse harm. Family is not a lifelong license to take without consent. Understanding this does not make you heartless. It makes you awake. This story is not about revenge. I did not act to punish my daughter or to humiliate anyone. I acted to recover my right to choose. There is a difference. Revenge anchors you to the injury. Choice releases you from it. To the women reading or listening who recognize pieces of themselves here, I want you to know something clearly. If you were made to feel unreasonable for asking questions, selfish for wanting transparency, or cruel for saying no, you are being trained to doubt your instincts. That doubt was never protection. It was a vulnerability others saw before you did. Not all relationships return to their former shape after truth enters them. Some do not return at all. That outcome is not failure. It is information. Grieving what you hoped for does not mean you were wrong to hope. It means you are brave enough to stop pretending. I do not claim peace arrived all at once. What arrived was space. Space to think without fear. Space to act without apology. Space to exist as something other than a resource. I did not lose my daughter that year. I lost the image of who I believed she was and who I believed I needed to be in order to keep her close. In losing that illusion, I gained something steadier than reconciliation. I gained my life back. Some stories do not end with reconciliation or applause. They end with clarity. This one was never about conflict alone, but about the quiet strength it takes to step out of a role that diminishes you and into a life that honors your worth. It reminds us that dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed through awareness, boundaries, and the courage to choose differently, even when that choice is painful. Time does not erase injustice, but it does offer perspective. And perspective, when accepted, can turn loss into direction and hurt into something that serves a deeper purpose. Freedom often arrives quietly, not as a victory over someone else, but as peace within yourself. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories that explore resilience, truth, and the courage to begin again.